The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harold Whitman adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. His wrinkled hands rested on the polished wooden bench, and his voice came out slow and steady. This court finds the defendant, Bradley Carter, not guilty. Gasps filled the room. A woman's wail pierced the air. James Holloway, the victim's older brother, shot up from his seat, knocking over the wooden chair. His dark brown eyes burned with fury as he stared at the 18-year-old boy standing next to his high-priced attorney. "You're letting him walk?" James shouted, his deep voice shaking with rage. "He stole my brother's car. He crashed it. He could have killed someone." The judge banged his gavel, his face unbothered. "Order in the court." Bradley Carter, the wealthy son of a real estate mogul, smirked, shoving his hands into the pockets of his expensive suit. His father, Richard Carter, gave a satisfied nod from the front row. He had pulled strings, made calls, and reminded the court of just how generous the Carter family had been to the city. James Holloway's fists clenched as he breathed heavily, his mother gripping his arm, tears running down her face. This wasn't just about the car. His brother, Marcus, had worked 3 jobs to afford that Mustang. It was his dream car, his one reward for years of struggle. And now it was totaled. But the real insult? Bradley had been drunk, racing through the streets, laughing, while Marcus's hard work crumbled into a pile of metal. And now, just like that, the judge had let him walk. Bradley strolled out of the courtroom with his father, looking untouchable. James wanted to scream, to lunge, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain his family felt. But then, a phone rang. It was Judge Whitman's clerk. She picked up, her face turning pale. The color drained from her cheeks as she listened, her fingers trembling against the receiver. The entire courtroom watched as her lips parted in shock. Then, she turned to the judge and whispered something in his ear. Whatever she said made his face go white. His hands tightened around the gavel, and for the first time that day, he looked shaken. Something had happened. Something big. Everything had just changed. Just 24 hours earlier, Marcus Holloway had been on top of the world. He had finally finished paying off his 2016 Mustang, a sleek black beauty with red racing stripes. The car was everything to him. It was his escape from the long shifts at the warehouse, from the constant struggle to make ends meet. When he was behind the wheel, blasting his favorite hip-hop tracks, he felt free. That night, he had parked outside Tasha's diner, waiting for his best friend, Caleb, to get off work. He was scrolling through his phone when a voice called out to him. "Yo, Marcus." He looked up and saw Bradley Carter swaggering toward him, flanked by 2 other rich kids, their expensive watches flashing under the streetlights. Marcus instantly felt his stomach tighten. Bradley was bad news. The kind of guy who could get away with anything. The kind of guy who saw people like Marcus as nothing more than background characters in his perfect little world. "I didn't know you could afford a ride like this," Bradley said, whistling as he ran his fingers along the car's smooth paint. Marcus sighed. "What do you want, Bradley?" Bradley grinned, his teeth practically glowing. "Let me take it for a spin." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, no." Bradley's grin didn't fade. Instead, he stepped closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Come on, man. I just want to see what she can do." "I said no," Marcus repeated, locking the doors. Bradley's smirk twitched. His friends shifted uncomfortably. They knew he wasn't used to hearing that word. Then, before Marcus could react, Bradley grabbed his wrist and twisted it. Hard. Marcus yelped in pain, his phone slipping from his fingers. In the split second he bent to grab it, Bradley shoved him back and yanked the keys from his hand. "No," Marcus shouted, lunging forward. But Bradley had already swung open the driver's side door and hopped in. "Bradley, don't do this," one of his friends warned. But Bradley didn't listen. He revved the engine, the Mustang growling like a beast before peeling out onto the road, tires screeching against the pavement. Marcus was left standing there, his fists shaking, watching helplessly as his car disappeared down the street. He had no idea that minutes later, his precious Mustang would be wrapped around a tree. Sirens blared. By the time Marcus arrived at the scene, the street was a mess of flashing red and blue lights. His car was totaled, its front end crumpled against a thick oak tree. The windshield was shattered, the hood smoking. Bradley stood a few feet away, a cocky smirk on his face as police officers questioned him. His designer jacket was scuffed, but otherwise, he looked fine. Marcus, however, was not fine. He stormed toward him, fury bubbling in his chest. "You destroyed my car," he shouted. Bradley just shrugged. "Yeah, well, it was fun while it lasted." That was the moment Marcus lost it. He lunged at Bradley, shoving him hard. Bradley stumbled back, but before anything more could happen, an officer grabbed Marcus from behind, pulling him away. "You should be arresting him," Marcus yelled. "He stole my car." The officer, a middle-aged man with a badge that read Sergeant Dawson, sighed. "Look, son, you need to calm down." "Calm down? He stole my car. He crashed it. And you're telling me to calm down?" Bradley, ever the rich kid with connections, smirked and dusted off his sleeves. "Relax, Marcus. It's just a car." That was when Marcus knew, deep in his bones, that Bradley wasn't going to face any real punishment. And he was right. Fast forward to the courtroom. Fast forward to the moment when the judge, despite all the evidence, let Bradley walk free. Fast forward to the moment when James Holloway realized that the system had failed them once again. But then, that phone call came. And suddenly, everything shifted. The judge's eyes flickered toward Bradley, and for the first time, the smirking rich boy's confidence wavered. Something was wrong. Something big. And in that moment, James Holloway knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Judge Harold Whitman's face had gone pale as he listened to whatever was being said on the other end of the phone. His hand trembled slightly, and for a brief moment, the courtroom was completely silent except for the muffled voice coming through the receiver. James Holloway, still standing, breathing hard, watched as the judge's jaw tightened. "What is it?" he demanded. The judge ignored him. Instead, he slowly leaned back in his chair and let out a long, shaky breath. Then, finally, he spoke. "We're going to need to take a short recess." His voice was quieter now, hesitant. The clerk nodded quickly and stepped back, but before she could move, James shouted again. "What's going on?" The judge hesitated, glancing toward Bradley Carter. The once smirking rich kid now looked slightly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Richard Carter, Bradley's father, stood up. "Your Honor, if we're done here, my son has places to be." The judge looked at him, then back at his clerk, then at the officers standing at the sides of the room. "No," he said at last. "We are not done." And then, before anyone could react, Judge Whitman turned to the officers and said something that sent shockwaves through the room. "Detain the defendant." A collective gasp rang out. Even Bradley's father's smug confidence flickered. "Excuse me," he scoffed. "You just let my son go." The judge's voice was firmer this time. "Not anymore." Two officers stepped forward. Bradley stiffened. His face, which had held nothing but arrogance minutes ago, now had a thin layer of sweat forming on his forehead. "What's happening?" Bradley stammered, stepping back. You said I was free to go." The officers didn't answer. They grabbed his arms and pulled them behind his back. James took a step forward, his heart pounding. "What's going on?" The judge exhaled through his nose, still gripping his gavel as if it was the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. "There's been a development," he said. Bradley twisted in the officer's grip, his cocky demeanor vanishing. "What development?" he demanded. The judge hesitated again. Then, the words that came out of his mouth sent shivers down everyone's spine. "Someone just found a body." Silence. The air in the courtroom suddenly felt suffocating. James heard his mother inhale sharply beside him. His stomach twisted. "What do you mean, a body?" Richard Carter asked, his voice suddenly not so confident. "That has nothing to do with my son." The judge fixed his eyes on Bradley. "They're saying it does." A chill ran down James's spine. "Marcus. Was it Marcus?" His hands clenched into fists. No, it couldn't be. He had just seen Marcus this morning. His brother was heartbroken over his car. Sure, but he was fine, right? His legs felt weak as he turned to one of the officers. "Who is it?" James demanded. "Who's the body?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, the bailiff stepped forward and announced, "Court is adjourned," but James barely heard him. His head was spinning, his stomach twisting into knots. He looked at his mother, who was gripping the front of her dress like she was trying not to collapse. Judge Whitman stood quickly, not meeting anyone's eyes, and rushed toward his chambers. The officers dragged Bradley Carter away, his face a mess of confusion and panic. Richard Carter, for the first time, looked nervous. James swallowed hard. Something wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. 1 hour earlier, Detective Sean Wilkes parked his car on the side of Lincoln Drive, right outside an abandoned lot. His partner, Detective Lisa Grayson, was already there, standing near a row of police cruisers. Their flashing lights bounced off the dark pavement, illuminating the area in bursts of red and blue. "What do we got?" Wilkes asked as he stepped out. Grayson sighed, adjusting the badge on her belt. "It's bad." Wilkes walked closer, following her to the edge of the lot. There, beyond the yellow tape, was a body. It was face down, half buried under a pile of garbage bags. The victim's clothes were torn, and from the looks of it, he had been dumped there in a hurry. Wilkes' stomach tightened. "Do we have an ID?" Grayson nodded grimly. "Yeah, and you're not gonna like it." She pulled out a wallet and handed it to him. Wilkes flipped it open, shining his flashlight over the ID, and his heart sank. Oh, hell. The name on the card read, Marcus Holloway. Wilkes looked up, suddenly feeling like the air had been knocked out of him. Grayson crossed her arms. "Yeah," she said quietly. "This just got messy." Wilkes' mind raced. He knew the Holloway case. Just this morning, he had read about Marcus's car being stolen and wrecked by some rich kid, Bradley Carter. And now, hours later, Marcus Holloway was dead. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had wanted him gone. And whoever it was, they had made sure he wasn't going to get justice. Wilkes didn't believe in coincidences. And right now, every instinct in his body was telling him that Bradley Carter had something to do with this. "Call the courthouse," he said quickly, handing the ID back to Grayson. "Tell them they need to hold that kid. Right now." Grayson nodded and pulled out her phone. Wilkes exhaled, his jaw tightening. Something told him this was just the beginning. And whoever killed Marcus Holloway, they were about to regret it. James Holloway's legs felt like they were made of cement as he pushed through the crowded hallway outside the courtroom. His ears were ringing. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. His mother was behind him, gripping his arm like she was afraid he'd collapse. He needed answers. He needed to know if what he had just heard was true. "Marcus can't be dead," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He repeated it again, louder this time, as if saying it out loud would make it real. "Marcus can't be dead." But the way the officers had looked at each other, the way the judge had suddenly panicked, the way Bradley Carter's smug face had melted into fear, none of it was right. James stormed toward one of the officers near the courtroom doors. "Where is he?" he demanded. "Where's my brother?" The officer looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we don't have all the details yet. You need to." "Don't tell me to calm down," James barked. "Tell me where my brother is." The officer hesitated. Then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, a familiar voice interrupted. "We're all trying to figure this out, James." James spun around to see Bradley Carter's father, Richard Carter, standing a few feet away. Adjusting the cuffs of his designer's suit like this was just another business meeting. James felt a fresh wave of rage surge through him. "You," he growled, stepping forward. "Your son stole my brother's car. And now my brother's dead." Richard sighed, shaking his head. "And what exactly are you trying to say?" James clenched his fists. "You know damn well what I'm saying. Your son killed him." Gasps rippled through the hallway. Reporters, who had been lingering outside the courtroom, turned their cameras toward the confrontation. James didn't care. He wanted the world to hear it. Bradley, who was still in police custody just a few feet away, turned pale. I didn't kill anyone," he stammered. "I stole his car. Yeah, but I didn't." "Shut up," James snapped, his voice shaking with rage. He turned back to Richard Carter, his jaw tight. "You're gonna cover this up, aren't you?" Richard met his eyes, his expression unreadable. Then, very calmly, he said, "James, Be very careful with what you say next." A slow, eerie silence followed those words. James felt the weight of them settle on his chest. He suddenly realized something. Richard Carter wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was in control. And that scared James more than anything. Before he could say another word, the courtroom doors swung open and a detective stepped out. James recognized him immediately. Detective Sean Wilkes. Wilkes was no nonsense, a man who had built a reputation for sniffing out corruption in the city. If anyone was going to get justice for Marcus, it was him. "James Holloway?" Wilkes called, his voice firm. James straightened. "Yeah." Wilkes sighed, then glanced at the reporters before jerking his head toward a quieter hallway. "Come with me. We need to talk." James's stomach turned to ice. This was it, the moment that would change everything. 20 minutes later, James sat in a small, dimly lit office inside the police station. His mother sat beside him, gripping a tissue, her face wet with tears. Across from them, Detective Wilkes leaned against his desk, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to figure out how to say something no one wanted to hear. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I won't sugarcoat this, James," Wilkes said. "We found your brother in an abandoned lot on Lincoln Drive." James squeezed his hands together, trying to stay upright. "He was beaten badly before he was killed," Wilkes continued, "and from the bruises on his arms, it looks like he fought back." James felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His mother sobbed softly beside him, whispering Marcus's name under her breath. Wilkes exhaled. "We're still processing the scene, but I can tell you this. This wasn't random. Somebody wanted Marcus dead." James shut his eyes for a second. He had expected this. He had felt it in his bones the second he saw the judge's face in the courtroom. But hearing it out loud, it was like someone had set fire to his chest. James's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Was it Bradley?" Wilkes hesitated. That pause was all James needed. "Come on, man," James pressed. "He stole my brother's car. He wrecked it. And now, just hours later, Marcus is dead?" He shook his head. "That's not a coincidence." Wilkes sighed. "I agree." James blinked. You do?" Wilkes nodded. "But agreeing and proving it are two different things. Right now, Bradley Carter is a suspect, but we don't have enough to charge him with murder." James clenched his jaw. "Then find something." Wilkes gave him a long, unreadable look. "We're working on it." James wasn't satisfied with that answer. Neither was his mother. But before either of them could say anything, a knock on the door interrupted them. An officer poked his head in. "Detective, we just pulled traffic cam footage from Lincoln Drive." Wilkes straightened. "And?" The officer's expression turned grim. "You're gonna want to see this." 5 minutes later, James stood behind Wilkes and his team as they huddled around a screen. The video was grainy, taken from a security camera at an intersection near the abandoned lot. It was nighttime, but the streetlights provided enough visibility. Wilkes pressed play. James held his breath. The footage showed a black SUV pulling up near the lot. The headlights flickered as the vehicle came to a stop. Then, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. James leaned in, his pulse racing. "Who is that?" Wilkes didn't answer. The man on the screen walked to the back of the SUV and opened the trunk. Then, James felt his stomach lurch. 2 other men stepped out. James's heart pounded in his ears. And then, they pulled something out of the trunk. A body. James's vision blurred with rage as he realized who it was. Marcus. His brother was still alive in the footage, barely moving, but still fighting. They had beaten him, dumped him like trash. But then came the worst part. One of the men turned toward the camera. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough. And James felt his blood turn ice cold when he recognized the face. It wasn't Bradley Carter. It was Richard Carter, Bradley's father, the powerful real estate mogul, the man who had looked James in the eye and told him to be careful. James felt his fists tighten. The entire courtroom had been focused on Bradley, on the spoiled, arrogant rich kid who thought he was untouchable. But they had been looking in the wrong place. The real danger had been standing right in front of them the whole time. James turned to Wilkes, his voice barely a whisper. "That man killed my brother." Wilkes nodded grimly. And then, just as James thought things couldn't get any worse, a second car appeared in the footage. And the person who stepped out of it made James's blood run cold. Because it was a police officer. And not just any officer. It was Sergeant Dawson, the same cop who had told Marcus to calm down the night Bradley crashed his car. James felt sick. Marcus hadn't just been murdered. He had been silenced. And the people responsible? They were some of the most powerful men in the city. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a war. The room was dead silent except for the soft hum of the video playing on loop. James Holloway couldn't breathe. His fists trembled at his sides, his vision tunneling in on the grainy footage before him. His brother, Marcus, beaten and barely conscious. Richard Carter, the powerful businessman, standing over him. Sergeant Dawson, the officer who had let Bradley Carter walk away after wrecking Marcus's car, appearing moments later like he was part of this. James felt something crack inside of him. His mother, seated behind him, let out a soft sob, rocking back and forth as she whispered, "My baby, my baby." Detective Wilkes sighed and ran a hand down his face. This just got a whole lot bigger. James turned to him, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "I don't care how big it is," he hissed. "You need to arrest Richard Carter. Right now." Wilkes didn't answer right away. He stared at the screen for a moment, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping against his leg. "Detective." James stepped closer, his voice filled with rage. "You have him on video. My brother was alive. And now he's dead. Richard Carter needs to be in handcuffs." Wilkes met his eyes. "You're right. But it's not that simple." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What do you mean it's not that simple?" "It's murder." Wilkes exhaled. "And it involves a very powerful man." James clenched his fists. "So what? You're scared of him?" Wilkes narrowed his eyes. "No, but I know how men like him operate. They have lawyers, they have judges in their pockets, and if we don't handle this the right way, he'll walk. Just like his son did." James wanted to punch something. His anger was boiling over, but deep down, he knew Wilkes was right. If Richard Carter was going to be taken down, it had to be airtight. Wilkes turned back to the footage. "We have to prove intent. We need to find out what happened between Bradley crashing Marcus's car and Richard showing up at that lot." James gritted his teeth. "And how do we do that?" Wilkes sighed. "We need to talk to Bradley Carter." James blinked. "Bradley?" Wilkes nodded. "He might be the key to all of this." James didn't like it. Bradley was a spoiled, arrogant punk who had never faced consequences in his life. But if there was even a chance that he knew why his father had done this, James was willing to take it. Wilkes straightened. "Let's go." Bradley Carter sat in an interrogation room at the precinct, his hands cuffed to the table. The smugness from earlier had completely disappeared. His suit jacket was gone, his blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and his blue eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. When the door opened and James stepped in, Bradley immediately stiffened. "Oh, hell no," he muttered, shifting in his seat. "What is he doing here?" James ignored him. He pulled out the chair across from Bradley and sat down, staring. Wilkes leaned against the wall. "We need to talk, Bradley." Bradley forced a weak smirk. "Yeah? About what?" "I didn't kill anyone." James slammed a fist on the table. "Your father did." Bradley flinched. His smirk faltered. "What?" Wilkes sighed. "We have security footage. It shows your father and two men dumping Marcus Holloway's body." Bradley's lips parted slightly. He swallowed hard, then quickly shook his head. No, that's not." James leaned forward. "You're going to tell me everything you know." Bradley's breath hitched. He glanced at Wilkes, then at the camera in the corner of the room, then back at James. I don't know anything," he stammered. James wasn't buying it. He could see the fear in Bradley's eyes. "You were drunk when you stole Marcus's car," James said, his voice low and dangerous. "But by the time you got arrested, you were calm. You knew something we didn't." Bradley shook his head again, but his leg bounced under the table. He was cracking. Wilkes took a step closer. "Bradley, listen to me. Your father can't protect you anymore. He has bigger problems. But if you help us, we might be able to help you." Bradley let out a nervous laugh. "Help me? Man, if my dad finds out I snitched." James cut him off. "Your dad isn't God, Bradley." He leaned even closer, lowering his voice. And right now, he's more afraid than you are. Bradley blinked rapidly, his breathing quickening. For the first time, James saw something in his face that he had never seen before. Real fear. Bradley licked his lips, looking down at his cuffed hands. His whole body was tense. Then, finally, he whispered, "They told me to keep my mouth shut." James's heartbeat spiked. Who? Bradley swallowed hard. After I crashed the car, my dad came to pick me up. But he wasn't alone. Wilkes leaned in. Who was with him? Bradley's hands shook. Sergeant Dawson. James felt his stomach drop. They put me in my dad's car, Bradley continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Dawson told me not to say anything about the accident. He said they would take care of it. Wilkes narrowed his eyes. And Marcus? Bradley hesitated. I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know they were gonna hurt him. James felt white-hot rage flood his veins. Bradley looked like he wanted to be anywhere but in that room. I thought my dad was just gonna pay him off or something. But then, later that night, my dad got a phone call. He left the house in a hurry. Wilkes frowned. Do you know where he went? Bradley hesitated again. Then, finally, he said he had to go take care of a loose end. Silence filled the room. James's hands trembled under the table. That was it. That was the moment Richard Carter decided Marcus had to die. Wilkes let out a slow breath. Bradley, listen to me. If you testify against your father, we can protect you. Bradley let out a bitter laugh. Protect me? From him? You don't get it, man. My dad's got cops, judges, even politicians in his pocket. You think one little statement from me is going to take him down? Wilkes held his gaze. It's a start. Bradley shook his head, but James saw it in his face. He was considering it. Wilkes straightened. Think about it. You have one chance to do the right thing. Then he and James stood, leaving Bradley alone in the room. The moment they stepped outside, Wilkes exhaled. This is bigger than I thought. James nodded, his hands shaking. It's a whole damn conspiracy. Wilkes looked down the hallway. We need a warrant for Richard Carter's arrest. James swallowed. And Dawson? Wilkes's face darkened. He's dirty. We have to be careful. Just then, an officer rushed toward them, his face pale. Detective, he panted. You need to see this. Wilkes tensed. What now? The officer hesitated. We just found another body. James's stomach clenched. Who? The officer swallowed. Sergeant Dawson. Everything stopped. Wilkes's eyes widened. What? He was found in his car, the officer said. Single gunshot to the head. James felt cold all over. Wilkes ran a hand down his face. Damn it. James knew exactly what this meant. Someone was cleaning up loose ends. And if Richard Carter was tying up his mess, then James Holloway was next. James Holloway's heart pounded like a war drum. His breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. Sergeant Dawson was dead. Murdered. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. Richard Carter was tying up loose ends. And if Dawson, the corrupt cop who had covered for him, had just been executed, then anyone who knew too much was in danger, including him. Wilkes turned sharply to the officer. Where was the body found? The officer swallowed. Inside his patrol car. Near the Carter estate. James felt a chill crawl down his spine. The Carter estate. Wilkes exhaled. Any signs of struggle? The officer shook his head. No. Whoever did it got in clean, took him out with a single shot, and left. No witnesses. James clenched his jaw. That was a hit. Wilkes nodded grimly. Yeah. And there's only one person who could have ordered it. Richard Carter. James's fists tightened. His brother's murderer was getting rid of anyone who could testify against him. He turned to Wilkes, his voice low and filled with rage. We need to move now. Wilkes nodded. Agreed. He turned to the officer. Call the judge. Get me a warrant for Richard Carter's arrest. Right now. The officer nodded and ran off. James exhaled sharply, trying to steady his nerves. But then, another officer came sprinting down the hall, his face even paler than the first. Detective, he shouted. We have another problem. Wilkes turned. What now? The officer took a deep breath. Bradley Carter just made bail. The world stopped. James's stomach dropped. What? Wilkes barked. The officer nodded quickly. His father sent his lawyers. They pulled some strings. He's walking out right now. James's blood boiled. He didn't even think. He just ran. James burst through the doors of the police station just in time to see Bradley Carter stepping into a sleek black SUV. His father stood beside him, calm, smug, as if the world around him didn't matter. Richard Carter met James's furious gaze and smiled. James saw red. He sprinted forward, shoving past officers. "You coward!" he roared. "You killed my brother." Bradley flinched, but Richard? Richard didn't react. He just watched. James lunged, but two officers grabbed him, holding him back. "James, stop." James struggled against them, his rage spilling over like an erupting volcano. "You think you can walk away from this?" he shouted. "You think I'm just gonna let you get away with it?" Richard finally spoke. "Calm down, son," he said smoothly. "You're making a scene." James lost it. "I'm not your damn son," he screamed. "You murdered my brother." Bradley's eyes darted between James and his father, a flicker of fear on his face. Richard sighed. Now, you have no proof of that." James's stomach twisted. Bradley knew. Bradley knew what his father had done. But would he talk? James glared at him. "Say it," he growled. "Tell the truth." Bradley hesitated. But then, Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. That was all it took. Bradley shut his mouth. James's heart sank. He had been so close. Richard smirked, then gently nudged Bradley toward the SUV. "Come, son. Let's go home." James thrashed against the officers. "You won't get away with this," he screamed. "You hear me? You won't get away with this." Richard didn't even look back. The doors shut. The SUV pulled away. And James Holloway, standing in front of the police station, knew one thing for certain. Richard Carter wasn't just cleaning up loose ends. He was winning. And if James didn't do something soon, he was going to be next. The city had never felt so cold. James Holloway sat in the dimly lit office of Detective Wilkes, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles had turned white. His entire body was shaking, not from fear, but from pure, unfiltered rage. Richard Carter had just walked out of that police station like nothing had happened. Marcus's murderer was free. And now, Sergeant Dawson, the only cop who could have testified against him, was dead. James turned to Wilkes. "We need to stop him." Wilkes exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You think I don't know that? Then do something." James snapped. Bradley Carter was ready to crack in that interrogation room. He was scared. Wilkes nodded. "Yeah, but now his father's got him back under control." James ran a hand down his face, his breathing uneven. "What now?" Wilkes was silent for a moment, then leaned forward. "Listen to me, James. Richard Carter is powerful, but he's not untouchable. We have video footage of him dumping Marcus's body. That's huge. But we need more." James frowned. "More?" Wilkes nodded. "We need to connect him directly to Marcus's murder. Right now, his lawyers are going to argue that he was just cleaning up after someone else." James's stomach twisted. "Someone else? Like who?" Wilkes's face darkened. "Like his son." James froze. "They're gonna throw Bradley under the bus," Wilkes continued. "They'll say he killed Marcus, and Richard only got rid of the body to protect his son." James's fist clenched. "That's bull." "I know," Wilkes interrupted. "But that's how people like Richard Carter operate. They twist reality until the truth is buried so deep that no one can see it." James's jaw tightened. "Then we need to dig it back up?" Wilkes studied him for a long moment. "You willing to do whatever it takes?" James didn't even hesitate. "I'll do whatever I have to." Wilkes nodded slowly. "Then I think I know where we start." 20 minutes later, James and Wilkes stood outside a rundown apartment complex on the east side of town. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Streetlights flickered overhead. A group of guys in hoodies lingered near the entrance, eyeing them suspiciously. James frowned. "Who are we here to see?" Wilkes checked his phone. "A guy named Trey Collins." James's brows furrowed. "Who the hell is Trey Collins?" Wilkes turned to him. "The third guy in the video." James's heart nearly stopped. "The third guy. The one who helped Richard Carter dump Marcus's body. James felt his pulse quicken. You're telling me this guy is still walking around free? Wilkes sighed. For now. But here's the thing. Trey Collins isn't like Richard Carter. He's small time. A street thug who got caught up in something way bigger than he could handle. James narrowed his eyes. And you think he'll talk? Wilkes nodded. If we play this right? Yeah. James exhaled, steadying himself. Then let's play it right. They knocked on the door 3 times. Silence. Wilkes knocked again. Trey. Open up. It's the police. Nothing. Then, just as James was about to speak, they heard a crash from inside. James's instincts kicked in immediately. He lunged forward, kicking the door open. The lock snapped, and the door swung wide. Inside, Trey Collins was scrambling toward a back window. Stop! Wilkes shouted. James didn't think. He moved. He sprinted across the room, grabbing Trey by the back of his hoodie and yanking him to the ground. Trey hit the floor hard, letting out a sharp grunt. James flipped him over, pinning him down. His pulse was racing. His hands were shaking. This was one of the men who dumped Marcus's body. James's brother. He gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around Trey's collar. You helped kill him. Trey's eyes widened in terror. I didn't. James slammed him against the floor. You dumped his body like trash. James. Wilkes grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back. We need him alive, not in a coma. James's breath was ragged. His vision was red. Trey coughed, his hands raised. I swear, I didn't kill him, man. James's jaw tightened. Then tell me who did. Trey swallowed hard. His whole body was trembling. Wilkes crouched beside him. Trey, listen to me. Richard Carter is killing people to clean this up. Dawson's already dead. You're next. Trey's breath hitched. D. Dawson's dead? James nodded. And if you don't start talking, you will be too. Trey's eyes darted between them. He was sweating, his breathing shallow. Then, finally, he whispered, it wasn't supposed to go that far. James and Wilkes exchanged a glance. Wilkes leaned in. What do you mean? Trey swallowed again. Bradley was never supposed to steal that car. That was Richard's idea. He wanted to scare Marcus. James's fist clenched. Scare him? Why? Trey hesitated. Because Marcus saw something he wasn't supposed to see. James's stomach dropped. Wilkes narrowed his eyes. What did Marcus see? Trey took a deep, shaky breath. Then, the Carters are running more than just real estate. James frowned. What are you talking about? Trey's voice dropped even lower. They launder money. A lot of it. And Marcus, he swallowed. He found out. James's blood ran ice cold. Wilkes's eyes widened. How? Trey hesitated. He worked at a warehouse part-time, right? James nodded slowly. Trey exhaled. That warehouse wasn't just a warehouse. He looked at Wilkes. You ever hear of Brightstone Logistics? Wilkes's face darkened. Yeah, the detective muttered. It's a front. Trey nodded quickly. Exactly. Carter's been using it to move money, drugs, whatever he needs. And Marcus, he swallowed. Marcus found out. He overheard something. He knew. James felt sick. Wilkes exhaled sharply. So Richard Carter didn't just kill Marcus because of the car. Trey shook his head. No. The car was just a way to get him alone. Silence. Then, James whispered. He killed my brother because Marcus was a threat. Wilkes nodded grimly. And if we can prove that, we don't just take down Richard Carter. He glanced at James. We take down everything. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This was bigger. This was about destroying the entire empire that killed him. And if Richard Carter wanted a war, James Holloway was ready to give him one. James Holloway barely felt his own body as he sat in the back of the unmarked police car, staring out into the city lights. The streets blurred past, a mix of neon glows and shadows, but none of it mattered. His brother was dead, killed not just out of cruelty, but because he knew something. Richard Carter wasn't just some rich, untouchable murderer. He was the head of something bigger, a criminal empire hiding in plain sight. And now, James had a choice. He could sit back and watch the system fail him again, or he could burn Richard Carter's world to the ground. Beside him, Detective Wilkes drove in silence. Trey Collins was in the back seat, handcuffed, his face pale as if he knew he had just signed his own death sentence. "We need to move fast," Wilkes said suddenly, breaking the silence. James exhaled. "How fast?" Wilkes's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Before Richard Carter realizes his little errand boy flipped, James glanced at Trey through the rearview mirror. The guy looked terrified. "You think Carter knows yet?" James asked. Wilkes sighed. "No, but it won't take long. People like him." He shook his head. "They don't guess when something goes wrong. They know." James swallowed. "So what's next?" Wilkes's eyes stayed on the road. "We put Trey in protective custody, and then we go after Brightstone Logistics." James frowned. "The warehouse?" Wilkes nodded. "Trey's right. Brightstone is a front. If we can tie Carter's money laundering operation to Marcus's murder, we don't just have one charge against him. We have dozens. That's how we bring him down." James clenched his fists. "Then let's do it." Wilkes nodded. "First, we need a search warrant. That'll take some time." James turned toward Trey. "And in the meantime?" Wilkes exhaled. "We hope Trey lives long enough to testify." Trey let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, good luck with that." James ignored him. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. 1 hour later, Wilkes had Trey transferred to a safe house under police guard, and James sat in a chair in Wilkes's office, rubbing his temples. Every muscle in his body screamed for revenge, but he knew Wilkes was right. They had to do this the right way. His phone vibrated. He pulled it out and saw a text. "Unknown number. I know what you're trying to do. Stop now, or you'll end up like your brother." James's stomach dropped. Wilkes noticed his reaction. "What is it?" James clenched his jaw and handed him the phone. Wilkes read the text, and for the first time, James saw something in the detective's face that made his blood go cold. Concern. Wilkes handed the phone back. "You need to be careful." James exhaled sharply. "I don't care if they come after me." Wilkes shook his head. "It's not just about you, James. Your mother. Your friends. Carter won't just go after you. He'll go after everyone you love." James felt a lump rise in his throat. His mom. His chest tightened. "I need to see her," he said suddenly. Wilkes frowned. "Are you sure that's safe?" James nodded. "I won't let Carter use her to get to me." Wilkes hesitated, then nodded. "I'll have someone keep an eye on the house." James didn't argue. He just grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. The Holloway house felt different. James stepped inside. His mother sitting on the couch, staring at an old picture of Marcus. She looked up, eyes red and tired. "James." He forced a weak smile. "Hey, Ma." She stood and immediately pulled him into a hug. For the first time that day, James let himself breathe. But before he could even sit down, a car pulled up outside. James froze. His mother tensed. "James?" James stepped toward the window. A black SUV. Not Richard Carter's usual vehicle, but similar enough to send alarm bells screaming through his head. Then, the doors opened. 2 men in suits stepped out. James's stomach dropped. His mother's breath hitched. "James, who are they?" James didn't answer. He knew exactly who they were. Carter had sent them. He turned to his mom. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone." Her eyes widened. "James, now." She hesitated, then nodded quickly, locking the front door. James grabbed the baseball bat near the entrance. He didn't have a gun, didn't have a weapon, but he wasn't going down easy. A knock echoed through the house. James didn't answer. Another knock. Then, a voice. "Mr. Holloway," the man outside said. His tone was calm, cold, rehearsed. "We just want to talk." James gritted his teeth. "Like hell you do." He peeked through the curtain. The 2 men stood too perfectly still. Their hands were hidden. Guns. James's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "I don't have anything to say to you," he called out. A pause. Then, "I think you do." James's grip tightened on the bat. They weren't leaving, and James wasn't running. He was ready for a fight. Then, crash. The back door shattered. James's eyes widened. They weren't waiting anymore. They were coming in. and James Holloway had seconds to act. James Holloway's instincts kicked in before he could think. The back door had shattered. They were coming in. His mother gasped, gripping his arm. "James, get upstairs," he ordered, shoving her toward the staircase. "Lock yourself in the bathroom. Don't come out until I say so." She hesitated, tears in her eyes. "Go," James shouted. She turned and ran up the stairs. James spun around, gripping the baseball bat. His heart pounded so fast it felt like it might explode. His breath was sharp and uneven. Footsteps. Slow, steady. The men weren't rushing. They weren't afraid. That meant they thought he was weak. They thought they could walk in here, take him, and leave without a problem. They thought wrong. James crouched near the kitchen entrance, gripping the bat tightly. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then, he saw the first man. A tall, broad-shouldered guy in a dark suit stepped cautiously into the house, gun raised. Silencer attached. James's chest burned with rage. They weren't here to scare him. They were here to end him. James acted first. He lunged forward, swinging the bat with everything he had. Crack! The bat smashed into the man's wrist, sending the gun flying. The guy let out a grunt of pain, staggering back. James didn't stop. He swung again, hard. The bat collided with the guy's ribs. A sickening crunch echoed through the house. The man collapsed, wheezing. One down. Then, a second shadow moved. James barely had time to react before a fist slammed into his side. Pain shot through his ribs. He stumbled, gasping. The second man, bigger, faster, was already moving. James swung the bat, but the man dodged, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him against the wall. His vision blurred. The bat fell from his grip. The man leaned in, whispering, "Mr. Carter sends his regards." James spit in his face. The man snarled and raised his fist. Then, bang, a gunshot. The man froze. His body jerked, then he stumbled forward and fell. James, still gasping for air, looked up. Detective Wilkes stood at the front door, gun smoking. "Damn," Wilkes muttered, stepping inside. "Told you to be careful." James coughed, rubbing his neck. "Yeah, well, guess I suck at listening." Wilkes kicked the man's body over, checking for a pulse. Nothing. James exhaled. "You kill him?" Wilkes shook his head. "Nah, shoulder shot. He'll live." He nodded toward the first guy, the one James had taken down. "That one." James smirked. "He'll live." Wilkes nodded approvingly. "Not bad." James let out a shaky breath. "How'd you know?" Wilkes holstered his gun. Saw the SUV from the station surveillance feed. Knew they weren't here for tea. James wiped sweat from his forehead. "Carter's getting desperate." Wilkes's expression darkened. "Yeah, which means we're running out of time." James swallowed. "We need to move on that warehouse." Wilkes nodded. "Tonight." James's stomach twisted, but he ignored the fear creeping up his spine. This wasn't just about getting justice anymore. It was about survival. If they didn't take Carter down tonight, James wouldn't live to see the morning. 2 hours later, James sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked police SUV as they approached Brightstone Logistics. Wilkes drove, his jaw tight. Beside them, 2 other officers in tactical gear loaded their weapons. James's heart pounded. This was it. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, shadowy structure in the industrial district. It looked abandoned from the outside, but they all knew better. It wasn't just a warehouse. It was Richard Carter's empire, and James was about to burn it down. Wilkes slowed the car, eyes scanning the area. "We do this clean. Get in, get what we need, get out." James exhaled. "And if Carter's men are inside?" Wilkes's eyes didn't leave the road. "Then we pray they shoot first." James glanced at the gun on Wilkes's belt. "Give me one," he said. Wilkes frowned. "Not happening." James glared. "If things go sideways, I'm not dying empty-handed." Wilkes sighed, then pulled out a backup pistol and handed it over. "Only use it if you have to." James took it, gripping the cold metal. "Trust me," he muttered. "I have to." They moved fast. Wilkes and his team pushed through the side entrance, weapons raised. Inside, the warehouse was massive. Rows of shipping containers, stacks of crates, Forklifts scattered across the floor. It smelled like oil and metal. James's adrenaline spiked. He could feel the danger. Wilkes motioned toward a nearby office. That's where Carter keeps the records. James nodded. Then let's get him. They crept forward. Every step felt like a lifetime. Then, a voice. Who the hell are you? James turned just in time to see a guard reaching for his gun. Bang. Wilkes fired first. The guard collapsed. Then, alarms blared. Red warning lights flashed across the warehouse. James's stomach twisted. Damn it! Wilkes shouted. Then, footsteps. Dozens of them. James spun around just as Carter's men came flooding in. Automatic rifles. Bulletproof vests. James felt the fear hit him like a truck. They weren't getting out without a fight. And from the smirk on Richard Carter's face as he stepped into view, he knew it too. Carter's voice was smooth. Gentlemen, he said, lighting a cigar. You really should have stayed out of my business. James raised his gun. Carter chuckled. Go ahead, boy. Shoot me. James's finger twitched on the trigger. But Carter didn't flinch. Because James knew the truth. If he pulled that trigger, he wouldn't make it out alive. The warehouse fell silent. James Holloway's finger hovered over the trigger of his gun, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Richard Carter stood just 10 feet away, a smug smirk on his face, puffing a cigar like he had already won. Surrounding them, at least 10 armed men. Automatic rifles. Tactical vests. They were ready. James wasn't. Wilkes was beside him, gun raised, eyes scanning the situation like a chessboard. They were outgunned, outnumbered. If James pulled the trigger, he'd die before Carter hit the floor. Carter knew it. That's why he was smiling. The crime boss exhaled a puff of smoke, tilting his head. You sure about that, kid? James's hands shook on the gun. His instinct screamed at him to shoot, to end it, to avenge Marcus. But then, drop the gun. One of Carter's men aimed a rifle at Wilkes's head. James's blood ran cold. Wilkes froze. His face stayed calm, but James saw his jaw tighten. Carter let out a slow chuckle. Come on, James. You're smarter than this. James's breath shuddered. His finger twitched, but Wilkes gave him a sharp look. Don't do it. James wanted to fight, but not like this. Not on Carter's terms. Slowly, painfully, he lowered the gun. Carter smirked. That's better. The moment James dropped the gun, one of Carter's men rushed forward and kicked it away. Wilkes gritted his teeth as they were forced to their knees. James glared up at Carter. You're a coward. Carter just smiled, crouching in front of him. A coward? No, kid. I'm a businessman. James clenched his fists. Carter flicked the cigar onto the ground and crushed it under his shoe. You had to know this was coming. Poking around my warehouse. Getting my guys arrested. That's not good for business. James's blood boiled. You murdered my brother. Carter sighed, shaking his head. You gotta stop taking things so personally, James. James's entire body tensed. Carter stood up, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. Then he turned to his men. Put them in the truck. James's stomach dropped. Truck. This wasn't just about stopping them. Carter was going to make them disappear. 2 of Carter's men grabbed James by the arms. He thrashed, but they were too strong. Wilkes struggled too, but a gun was jammed into his ribs. Don't make this worse, one of the men muttered. James's pulse raced. This is how it ends. His mother would never know what happened to him. Marcus's killer would walk free. Carter was going to win. Until a gunshot. Not from Carter's men. From the entrance. Bang. One of Carter's men collapsed. The others spun around. Bang. Bang. Another gunfight erupted. James's mind spun. Who was shooting? Then, he saw movement. Dark figures flooded into the warehouse. Armed. Moving with precision. Not cops. Not Carter's men. Someone else. Then, James saw him. Bradley Carter. Holding a gun. And firing at his father's men. What the hell? Richard Carter's smug expression vanished. What the? Bradley aimed his gun at his own father. Let them go, Bradley ordered, his voice shaking but firm. Richard's eyes widened. Bradley? The shooting stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Then Richard laughed. Laughed. Oh, son. He shook his head, smiling. You don't have it in you. Bradley's grip on the gun tightened. Try me. James couldn't believe it. Bradley Carter just saved his life. Wilkes acted fast. He shoved an elbow into the distracted guard holding him, grabbed the man's gun, and turned the tables. James followed suit, headbutting one of the guys gripping him. He broke free, diving for his fallen gun. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunfire. Shouting. Carter's men scattered. James grabbed his gun and turned. Richard Carter was running. James's rage exploded. Carter, he bellowed. Carter didn't look back. James sprinted after him. Through the warehouse. Past the crates. Out the back exit, into the night. Richard Carter was fast. But James was faster. Bam! James tackled him to the pavement. Carter let out a grunt as his body slammed against the concrete. James rolled, pinning him down. His fist flew. Crack. He punched Carter across the jaw. Again. Again. For Marcus. For everything. Carter coughed, blood spilling from his lips. You don't have the guts? James pressed the gun to his forehead. Carter's breathing slowed. James's finger hovered over the trigger. He could end it. Right now. Make sure Carter never hurt anyone again. Make sure he never walked free. Carter smirked. Do it, he whispered. Be just like me. James's hands trembled. For a moment, the whole world disappeared. It was just him, Carter, and the weight of vengeance. Then, a voice. James. Wilkes. James's head snapped up. Wilkes stood just a few feet away. His gun was raised, but not at Carter. At James. Don't, Wilkes said softly. We got him. Let's do this the right way. James's chest heaved. Every muscle in his body screamed to pull the trigger, to end this monster. But then, he thought of Marcus. Marcus, who always did the right thing. Marcus, who believed in justice, even when the system failed him. James's eyes burned. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. Carter let out a breathless chuckle. That's my boy. James punched him again. Carter went limp. Wilkes nodded. Now that's the right way. Then, finally, Wilkes pulled out his cuffs and snapped them onto Richard Carter's wrists. For Marcus. For everything. It was over. The sirens wailed, red and blue lights flooding the dark alley as police units swarmed the warehouse district. Richard Carter lay on the cold pavement, cuffed and beaten. His smirk was gone. The air of untouchable power he had carried for years had vanished. James Holloway stood over him, fists clenched, breathing ragged. It was over. Wilkes holstered his gun and turned to the approaching officers. Take him in, he ordered. Charges include murder, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and we'll throw in attempted murder while we're at it. The officers hauled Carter to his feet. For the first time, he looked afraid. James stepped closer, locking eyes with him. The monster who had taken Marcus from him. Carter licked his bloody lips. You think this is over? He rasped. James didn't blink. I know it is. Carter smirked weakly. You have no idea who you're dealing with, boy. James took a deep breath. His rage, his grief, his pain. It boiled inside of him. But this time, it didn't control him. He leaned in, voice steady. Stronger. You're right, James said. I didn't. He glanced around. At the cops, at the flashing lights, at the people Carter had once owned like pawns on a chessboard. But now? James's lips curled into a smirk of his own. I do. And with that, he turned away. Wilkes grabbed Carter by the collar and shoved him toward the patrol car. Enjoy your cell, Carter. It's a lot smaller than your mansion. Carter struggled, but it didn't matter. For the first time in his corrupt, twisted life, Richard Carter was on the losing side. The doors slammed shut. James let out a slow, shaky breath as he watched the police car pull away. He should have felt relief, but all he felt was exhaustion. 1 week later, James sat on the front steps of his house, the air quiet for the first time in days. His mother was inside, resting. She had barely spoken since Marcus's funeral. Neither had James. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Wilkes pulled up in an unmarked car, stepping out with 2 cups of coffee. James raised a brow. You expecting me to drink that? Wilkes shrugged, tossing it to him. Figured you could use it. James caught the cup but didn't sip. You here to check on me? Wilkes exhaled, sitting on the step beside him. Carter's empire is falling apart. The feds are swarming Brightstone, arresting his men left and right. James nodded but didn't speak. Wilkes studied him for a moment. You did the right thing, you know. James let out a dry chuckle. Doesn't feel like it. Wilkes sighed. Justice takes time, kid. But we got him. Marcus didn't die for nothing. James swallowed, staring at the ground. I just keep thinking, what if I had done something sooner? Wilkes shook his head. Don't do that to yourself. Silence. Then, you ever think about joining the force? Wilkes asked suddenly. James frowned. What? Wilkes sipped his coffee. You've got a good head on your shoulders. You don't back down. And let's face it, our department could use someone who actually gives a damn. James scoffed. You serious? Wilkes nodded. Think about it. James looked down at the steaming coffee cup in his hands. Did he want that? Did he want to fight for justice? For people like Marcus? He wasn't sure. But for the first time since this nightmare started, he had a choice. Wilkes stood, adjusting his coat. Take your time, kid. You earned it. James watched him walk back to his car, his mind racing. A week ago, he was just a grieving brother, helpless against the system. Now, he had taken down one of the most powerful criminals in the city. Maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. Wilkes opened the car door but paused. Oh, one more thing. James looked up. What? Wilkes smirked. Bradley Carter's testifying against his father. James's eyebrows shot up. What? Wilkes chuckled. Turns out, almost getting murdered makes you rethink things. James let out a slow breath. Maybe some people could change. Wilkes tipped his head in a casual goodbye. See you around, Holloway. And then he was gone. James stared at the empty street, his mind buzzing. Maybe he wasn't done fighting. Maybe this city still needed him. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. For Marcus. For himself. And for everyone still waiting for justice. James took a deep breath. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt alive.